Officer Daniels was having one of those mornings when nothing seemed to go smoothly. The sky was pale and overcast, and the light drizzle made the streets shiny and slippery. He had been patrolling the same neighborhood for years, so he knew most of the people by sight. But even familiarity didn't make the day easier. Today, something in the air seemed tense, like the calm before a storm. As he drove down the quiet street in his patrol car, he noticed a young man awkwardly pulling his small sedan to the side. The car seemed older and a little battered, but nothing unusual for this part of town. What caught Officer Daniels' attention was the nervous way the man was fumbling with his wallet and glancing around as if expecting trouble. The officer felt a tight knot form in his stomach. His gut told him something was off, even though he couldn't say exactly what. He flipped on the patrol car lights and pulled the vehicle over. The young man immediately looked panicked. He quickly tried to roll down his window, his hands trembling. Officer Daniels parked behind him and stepped out, boots crunching on the wet asphalt. The officer's expression was serious, eyes scanning the young man from head to toe. There was a tension in the air that made the soft rain feel heavier. "Good morning, sir," Officer Daniels said, his voice steady but firm. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The young man swallowed hard. I think maybe I was going a bit over the speed limit," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Daniels nodded slowly. "That's right. You were going faster than allowed. Can I see your license and registration?" The young man's hands shook as he reached for his wallet. Every movement seemed exaggerated, almost frantic, as if he was under invisible pressure. Officer Daniels noticed this, and his irritation began to rise. He had seen many drivers over the years, and most of them would hand over their documents calmly. But this man's behavior seemed suspicious, almost deliberate, as if he was hiding something. "Please, sir, hurry up," Officer Daniels said, his voice carrying a hint of impatience. "I don't have all day." The young man's eyes darted around nervously. He seemed frozen between fear and embarrassment. He stammered slightly as he handed over the documents. Officer Daniels examined them closely. Everything appeared in order. Valid license, insurance, registration, but he wasn't convinced. Something in the young man's manner set off alarms in the officer's mind. "Sir, are you carrying anything you shouldn't be?" the officer asked, his tone sharper now. "Drugs, weapons, anything illegal?" The young man's face paled. He shook his head quickly. "No, officer, nothing. I swear." Officer Daniels didn't immediately believe him. His eyebrows furrowed and his jaw tightened. He had dealt with many people who lied to avoid trouble. But there was something unusual about this one. He was too nervous, almost desperate to prove his honesty. The officer took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but he also couldn't ignore his instincts. "Step out of the car, please," Officer Daniels said. The young man hesitated, biting his lip and shaking slightly. Finally, he obeyed, stepping onto the wet pavement carefully. The officer noticed the way he tried to keep his hands visible, but they were trembling so much that it was hard to tell. The man's shoes were wet from the rain, and his coat clung to his body. He looked smaller than he probably was, almost like a child in an adult's world. Officer Daniels led him to the side of the car, keeping a careful eye. He asked simple questions, trying to assess the situation. "Where are you headed this morning?" The young man swallowed nervously. I'm going to the pharmacy, officer. I need to pick up some medication." "Medication?" Officer Daniels asked, raising an eyebrow. "Why are you so nervous then?" The young man fidgeted, unable to meet the officer's gaze. I get anxious around police, sir. I don't mean any trouble, I get nervous and I don't know why." Officer Daniels studied him, trying to gauge if this was a lie or genuine fear. The man's hands kept moving, twisting the fabric of his coat, rubbing the sleeves as if he was trying to calm himself. The officer noticed every detail, the trembling lips, the shallow breaths, the darting eyes. Something about the young man's behavior was different from the usual suspects who tried to lie or deceive. There was no arrogance, no bravado, only raw anxiety. As the officer continued questioning, neighbors began peeking from their windows and doorways. Some walked closer to see what was happening. The young man's panic seemed to grow with the attention. Officer Daniels felt a flicker of frustration. He had been patient so far, but the nervous energy radiating from the man was contagious. His assumptions about dishonesty started to take firmer root. He wondered if the man was hiding something bigger than just a traffic violation. "I need you to be honest with me, sir," Officer Daniels said, his voice firm but controlled. "If you're holding anything illegal, now is the time to speak up." The young man shook his head vigorously, almost violently. "No, officer. I'm not hiding anything, I swear." Officer Daniels studied him for a long moment, his mind running through scenarios. He had to make a decision, either treat this as a simple traffic stop or escalate it based on his instincts. He noticed small things, the man's quick, shallow breaths, the way his eyes avoided contact, and the faint tremor in his hands. Every detail seemed to confirm the officer's growing suspicion. "I'm going to need to check your car," Officer Daniels said finally. The young man's face turned pale again and he nodded quickly, almost spilling his words. "Of course, officer. Please go ahead." The officer signaled and carefully began inspecting the car. The interior was neat, orderly even, with nothing out of place. The glove compartment, the seats, the floor, all clean. The young man's behavior made less sense now, but Officer Daniels' suspicion hadn't fully vanished. He wondered if there was something subtle he was missing. While searching, he asked more questions, trying to see if the young man's story held up. The man answered honestly, explaining why he was anxious and why he had been fidgety. He mentioned that he had a rare condition that sometimes caused his body to react strongly under stress. Officer Daniels didn't immediately catch the full meaning. He nodded, still skeptical, feeling that the explanation was convenient, maybe even rehearsed. The rain continued to fall lightly, dripping from the leaves onto the sidewalk. Officer Daniels paused for a moment, wiping his hands on a towel he carried. He looked at the young man again, noticing how tense he still was. The officer's mind was a mix of irritation and concern. He realized that this moment could go either way. He could either treat the young man harshly or try to understand what was really happening. The young man tried to explain more, talking about the medications he needed to manage his condition. Officer Daniels listened, though his assumptions were still hard to shake. He thought about how often he judged people too quickly, how many times he had been proven wrong. But this man's nervous energy was unlike anything he had seen before. It didn't fit the patterns he knew. Finally, Officer Daniels stepped back, taking a deep breath. He needed to decide whether to escalate or to show patience. His instincts had pushed him toward anger, toward suspicion. But now a small voice of reason whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was missing something important. He noticed the young man's genuine struggle to maintain calm, the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with guilt. This observation made the officer pause just enough to let the tension hang in the air without breaking. The rain kept falling, the sound soft against the car roof. Officer Daniels studied the young man one last time before he decided what to do next. He had assumed the worst from the very beginning, letting his frustration shape his perception. But something in the young man's eyes, something small and almost invisible, was beginning to challenge those assumptions. It was a mark of truth that neither impatience nor suspicion could hide. For now, Officer Daniels remained silent, watching, waiting, and noticing. The young man stood there, tense but honest, and the officer realized that the story was far from over. He didn't yet know the full truth, but he sensed that what he assumed about this young man might crumble completely. He also knew that the next moments could change everything about how he viewed this encounter. The quiet street, the gentle rain, and the nervous figure in front of him set the stage for something unexpected to emerge. A lesson in patience, observation, and the power of noticing the small but revealing details that people often overlooked. Officer Daniels watched the young man carefully, trying to decide what to do next. The first part of the stop had been tense, and now the air felt heavier with each passing second. He could see the nervousness in the young man's movements, the way he shifted from one foot to another, and how his hands fidgeted with the edges of his coat. The officer had faced many situations like this, but something about this one was different. The young man seemed genuinely anxious, not guilty. Yet Officer Daniels' mind kept circling back to the possibility that he was missing something. "Sir," the officer said, keeping his voice calm but firm, "I need you to be honest with me. I need to know exactly why you are so nervous." The young man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving up and down. I get nervous when I talk to police, officer. It's not that I've done anything wrong. I panic sometimes. My hands shake and I don't know how to stay calm." Officer Daniels looked at him closely. The young man's voice was steady now, but the trembling hands and darting eyes told a story that words alone could not. It was a story of fear, of anxiety, of being misunderstood. The officer had seen people lie, but he had also seen people struggle under pressure. This was different. There was no edge of deceit, no attempt to manipulate, only fear. "Do you have any identification?" the officer asked, though he already had it in hand. The young man fumbled, pulling out his wallet, and handed over his documents again. Officer Daniels studied the papers, noting that everything was in order. His suspicion didn't fully disappear, but a part of him began to wonder if his anger was misplaced. The officer walked around the car, peering inside, making sure nothing was hidden in the seats or on the floor. The young man followed quietly, standing a few steps behind. He did not protest, nor did he appear to be hiding anything. Officer Daniels' frustration began to soften, replaced by a quiet curiosity. He wanted to understand this person, to see why he was so anxious and why the interaction had escalated so quickly. Neighbors had begun to take notice. A few people peeked from behind curtains while others came closer, watching from a safe distance. The young man seemed to shrink under the attention, his anxiety growing with every gaze. Officer Daniels felt a flicker of guilt. He realized that part of the man's nervousness was amplified by the spectators, by the feeling of being judged not only by him but by the entire street. "Sir," Officer Daniels said gently, "I need you to tell me about your day. What brought you here this morning?" The young man hesitated, then took a deep breath. I need to go to the pharmacy. I have some medications I need to pick up. If I miss my doses, I get really sick. I can't handle stress well, and talking to police makes me panic. I didn't mean to worry anyone. I get scared." Officer Daniels nodded slowly, absorbing the words. He could see the truth in the man's eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The story did not fit the narrative he had built in his head, and yet it explained so much. The trembling hands, the shallow breaths, the inability to meet his gaze. It all made sense now. The young man wasn't lying. He wasn't hiding anything illegal. He was simply struggling with fear. "Can you show me your prescription?" the officer asked after a moment of silence. The young man reached into his coat pocket and handed over a small slip of paper with neat handwriting. Officer Daniels examined it carefully, noting the details and confirming the validity of the prescription. His assumptions began to crumble slowly, replaced by a sense of understanding he hadn't expected. "I see," Officer Daniels said softly. I didn't understand before. Thank you for explaining it to me." The young man's shoulders relaxed slightly. He let out a small sigh, the tension leaving his body in waves. I just wanted to be honest, officer. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Officer Daniels nodded. He felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief that the situation was not as he feared, and guilt that his initial assumptions had been harsh and possibly intimidating. He realized how quickly he had jumped to conclusions, letting frustration and past experiences shape his perception of this person. The rain continued to fall softly, tapping against the car roof and the pavement. Officer Daniels studied the young man one last time. He noticed small details he had overlooked before: the slight tremor in his wrist, the way his lips pressed together to hold back his anxiety, the faint mark on his wrist that he had not seen initially. These details, subtle but important, told a story he hadn't fully understood until now. The young man's voice broke the silence. I'm sorry if I seemed rude or evasive. I can't control the panic sometimes." Officer Daniels shook his head. "No, you don't need to apologize. I should have noticed sooner that something was affecting you. It's easy to misjudge people when we only see the surface. I see now that you weren't trying to hide anything." The officer began to reflect on the encounter. He remembered times when his assumptions had led him astray, when he had misread nervousness as guilt. He thought about how quickly anger can take over, how easy it is to let frustration guide decisions instead of observation and empathy. Today had been a reminder that every person had a story, often invisible, and that it was his duty to notice before judging. Neighbors continued to watch, some nodding quietly at the officer's calm demeanor. The young man straightened his posture, feeling seen and understood in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was a moment of human connection, brief but profound, where tension gave way to recognition and empathy. The officer and the young man shared a silent understanding, each aware of the fragility and strength of the human experience. Officer Daniels finally spoke, his voice steady and warm. "You can go to the pharmacy. Be careful on the road and take care of yourself." The young man nodded, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you, officer. I appreciate it." As he returned to his car, Officer Daniels watched him drive away, the rain making the world glisten in muted shades of gray. He felt a quiet satisfaction mixed with reflection. The encounter had started with tension and suspicion, but it ended with understanding and compassion. He had learned to look beyond the surface, to notice the details that revealed the truth, and to resist letting assumptions dictate actions. The officer returned to his patrol car, letting the rain wash over the hood. He thought about the small mark on the young man's wrist, a detail that had gone unnoticed at first but had changed everything once seen. He realized that life often presented these small but important cues, and it was his responsibility to pay attention. In moments of judgment, the truth could be hidden in the details, waiting for someone to notice. For the rest of the morning, Officer Daniels drove through the neighborhood with a lighter heart. He felt more aware, more patient, and more attuned to the subtle signs of human vulnerability. The encounter had reminded him that every person carried struggles invisible to the eye, and that sometimes understanding required nothing more than noticing, listening, and believing. It was a lesson he would carry with him, a story he would remember every time he approached someone with assumptions and a need to judge. Even as the day continued, and new calls came through the radio, Officer Daniels held on to that feeling. He knew there would be more tense moments, more nervous faces, more situations where his patience and observation would be tested. But he also knew that he had the capacity to change, to learn, and to grow from each encounter. And as he drove past the quiet streets and wet sidewalks, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that the smallest details could make the biggest difference in understanding the people around him. Officer Daniels had been watching the young man closely for a while, and despite the earlier tension starting to fade, he still felt a flicker of unease. There was something about the way people reacted under pressure that caught his attention. The young man's nervous energy was different from the usual patterns he had seen. It was raw and unpolished, almost honest, and yet it carried a sense of vulnerability that made the officer pause. As the young man spoke about his medications, trying to explain his nervousness, Officer Daniels noticed something small, almost hidden under the sleeve of his coat. A faint mark, a small tattoo on his wrist, became visible when he lifted his hand slightly. The officer leaned in, curious. The mark was delicate but distinct, a symbol that he hadn't seen before but immediately recognized from a few training sessions he had attended. It was a medical alert symbol, something worn by people with conditions that required emergency attention. Suddenly, a shift happened inside Officer Daniels. The tension he had carried, the suspicion that had tightened like a knot in his chest, began to dissolve. The angry thoughts that had made him quick to judge and doubt the young man vanished as he realized the significance of that tiny symbol. The young man's trembling hands, his quick breaths, and the way he avoided eye contact were no longer signs of deceit or guilt. They were signs of anxiety and a medical condition that could be triggered under stress. Officer Daniels took a step back, giving himself a moment to breathe. He allowed himself to see the young man not as a potential suspect, but as a human being struggling to maintain control over his body and mind. The officer's own frustration, built up over minutes of misunderstanding, seemed almost unnecessary now. The story that had begun with tension and suspicion transformed instantly into one of understanding and compassion. The young man, still tense and unaware that the officer had noticed the mark, continued to explain his routine, the importance of his medications, and how certain situations could overwhelm him. Officer Daniels listened with full attention, letting the words sink in without interjecting. He felt a growing respect for the young man's honesty and courage. The small tattoo on his wrist had changed everything. It was a detail that made sense of behavior that otherwise would have been confusing and alarming. The rain continued to fall softly, creating a steady rhythm on the car roof and the street around them. The sound seemed to calm both of them, offering a quiet space for the officer to process his own thoughts. He realized how easily assumptions could cloud judgment, how quick he had been to misinterpret anxiety as dishonesty. Now, seeing the truth revealed in that subtle mark, he felt a deep sense of relief. "I see it now," Officer Daniels said, his voice gentle. "I understand why you were nervous. I didn't realize you had a medical condition that could make this situation so stressful. The young man blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. He hadn't expected understanding, and he had certainly not expected the officer's anger to disappear. A faint smile appeared on his lips, a mix of relief and gratitude. "Yes, officer," he said softly. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I panic sometimes and it's hard to control." Officer Daniels nodded. "I believe you. I see now that you weren't trying to hide anything or be deceptive. Your nervousness makes sense given your condition. Thank you for explaining it." The young man's shoulders relaxed noticeably. The weight of fear that had been pressing down on him for minutes, maybe even hours, began to lift. He felt seen, understood, and for the first time in a long moment safe. The officer's perception had changed entirely, and it was evident in the way he now addressed the young man, with patience, empathy, and respect. Officer Daniels took another step closer, lowering his voice so that only the young man could hear. "I need you to know that it's okay to be nervous. What matters is that you are honest, and I see that you are. That's all I wanted to know." The young man nodded again, the subtle tremor in his hands easing slightly. "Thank you, officer. I really appreciate it." The rain continued to fall and the world felt quieter somehow. The neighbors who had been watching from a distance seemed to fade into the background. The focus was entirely on the two of them, one learning to understand, the other learning that being seen and believed could make a difference in the most stressful moments. Officer Daniels took a deep breath, realizing how small details could have such a profound impact. A tiny tattoo, almost invisible at first glance, had completely changed his perception. It reminded him that assumptions were dangerous, and that understanding often required patience and careful observation. He made a mental note to pay closer attention in the future, to notice the subtle signs that revealed deeper truths. "You can go about your day now," Officer Daniels said finally, his tone light and reassuring. "Be careful and take care of yourself." The young man thanked him once more before returning to his car. As he drove away, Officer Daniels watched him for a moment, reflecting on the encounter. It had started with anger and suspicion, but it had ended with understanding and empathy. He felt a quiet pride in having recognized the truth, even if it had taken longer than it should have. The officer returned to his patrol car, letting the rain drip from his hat and coat. He thought about the power of noticing, of looking beyond surface behavior, and of how easily misunderstandings could arise. This encounter had been a clear example of how assumptions could crumble in an instant when the truth revealed itself. Driving through the neighborhood again, Officer Daniels felt a renewed sense of awareness. Every person he would encounter in the future might carry hidden struggles, subtle marks of their experiences, or silent stories that he could miss if he didn't pay attention. The small tattoo he had noticed today had reminded him of the importance of observation and empathy. It was a lesson in patience and understanding, a reminder that appearances could be misleading. For the rest of his shift, Officer Daniels remained mindful of the encounter. He noticed small gestures, subtle signs of stress, and quiet hints that people gave, often unintentionally. He realized that human behavior was complex, and that rushing to judgment could lead to unnecessary conflict or misunderstanding. He felt grateful for the young man, who had inadvertently taught him a lesson about patience, perception, and empathy. Even as new calls came through the radio, Officer Daniels carried the memory of the young man's nervous energy and the revealing mark on his wrist. It had been a turning point, a moment when assumptions crumbled and understanding took their place. The encounter reminded him that every person deserved the chance to be seen for who they truly were, beyond first impressions and surface-level judgments. The rain continued, a soft curtain over the streets, a gentle reminder that life often offered opportunities to notice what truly mattered. Officer Daniels felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had learned something important today, something that would guide him in future encounters. And as he drove through the quiet neighborhood, he carried with him a sense of patience, understanding, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest details could change everything. After noticing the small tattoo on the young man's wrist, Officer Daniels felt a wave of understanding wash over him. The tension that had built up in the first moments of the traffic stop seemed to dissolve into something softer, something more human. He realized that his anger and suspicion had been based on assumptions, and that his perspective had been limited by what he had seen, without truly observing the whole picture. "Thank you for explaining your situation," Officer Daniels said gently. "I should have noticed the signs earlier. Your nervousness makes sense now." The young man nodded, relief spreading across his face. I just wanted to be honest, officer. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I can't always control how my body reacts. I get overwhelmed easily." Officer Daniels studied him, noticing the way the young man's shoulders were beginning to relax, how his hands were finally steadying. The moment felt quiet, almost suspended, as though the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. It was a rare kind of understanding, a connection that didn't need words to be fully felt. The officer felt a deep respect for the young man, for his courage to face his fears and his honesty despite being under intense stress. "It's okay to be anxious," the officer continued, his voice softening. "What matters is that you were honest with me. That's all anyone can ask for. You didn't do anything wrong." The young man's eyes filled slightly with gratitude, and he gave a small nod. "I appreciate that, officer. I really do." Officer Daniels took a step back and let silence hang for a moment. He thought about how quickly he had assumed the worst, how his own frustration had influenced the way he judged the young man. He realized that his assumptions had almost created a conflict that didn't need to happen. This reflection reminded him of the responsibility that came with his role. Every person he interacted with could have unseen struggles, and every judgment he made without observation could impact someone's life. He asked gently, "Can you tell me more about your condition? It might help me understand better." The young man hesitated, then spoke, explaining how his medical condition sometimes made him panic and caused physical reactions like shaking hands and rapid breathing. He described how certain stressors, even as simple as talking to a police officer, could trigger these responses. Officer Daniels listened closely, noting every detail, not just as information, but as a way to see the person in front of him for who he truly was. The officer felt a mixture of emotions, relief that the young man was safe and truthful, guilt for having misjudged him, and admiration for his honesty and perseverance. He realized that being a police officer was not just about enforcing rules, but also about understanding people, about seeing beyond surface behavior to the real story underneath. It was a lesson he hadn't needed to learn theoretically. He was learning it in real time right here, on the quiet, rain-soaked street. "I can see now why you were nervous," Officer Daniels said. "And I want you to know that it's completely understandable. I've been in your shoes before in my own way, feeling anxious or panicked, and I know it's not easy." The young man's expression softened. He felt seen in a way that was rare. The acknowledgement from the officer was more powerful than any words of reassurance. It wasn't just about being let go from a traffic stop. It was about being recognized as a person with struggles, fears, and honesty. "It's important for me to understand these things," Officer Daniels continued. "I need to see the signs, the small details, so I don't misjudge someone. You've taught me that today. Even something as small as that tattoo on your wrist can change everything." The young man looked down at his wrist where the mark had always been, subtle but meaningful. He hadn't realized that such a small detail could carry so much weight in how someone else perceived him. It was a reminder that people often carry unseen stories, and that these stories could change how they are understood if noticed. The realization brought a quiet smile to his face. "I'm glad you see it now, officer," he said softly. "It means a lot that you took the time to notice. Most people just see nervousness or mistakes and assume the worst." Officer Daniels nodded, feeling the truth of the words. "You're right, and I've learned to be more careful with my assumptions. It's easy to jump to conclusions, but every person has a story. Every detail can matter. Today was a reminder of that." He glanced around at the street, the soft rain, the few neighbors who had been watching, and felt a sense of calm settle over him. The young man, once tense and fearful, now stood with a new sense of relief. The encounter that had begun with frustration and suspicion had evolved into a shared moment of understanding and empathy. It was a reminder of the power of patience and observation, of the difference between judging and truly seeing someone. "I'm going to let you go now," Officer Daniels said finally. "Drive safely and take care of yourself. Remember, your honesty and courage matter more than anything else." The young man nodded, a genuine smile on his face now, and thanked the officer once more.
"I will, officer."
"Thank you for listening and understanding." As he returned to his car, Officer Daniels watched for a moment, reflecting on the encounter. The small tattoo on the young man's wrist, the nervous gestures and the anxious words had all been pieces of a puzzle that revealed a deeper truth. The officer realized that noticing and understanding those pieces could prevent misunderstanding and conflict. It was a lesson in patience, empathy, and the importance of paying attention to the details that often go unnoticed. The rain continued to fall, soft and steady, washing over the streets and the cars. Officer Daniels returned to his patrol vehicle, letting the water drip from his coat and hat. He thought about the young man, about the courage it took to remain honest under pressure, and about the impact of a single moment of understanding. It was a quiet victory, a moment that would stay with him for a long time. Throughout the rest of his shift, Officer Daniels remained mindful of the encounter. He noticed subtle signs of stress, the quiet struggles of people he met, and he reminded himself to pause and observe before forming judgments. The lesson he had learned was simple but profound. Patience, attention to detail, and empathy could transform tense situations into moments of connection and understanding. Even as new calls came over the radio and the day moved on, Officer Daniels carried the memory of the young man and the small tattoo that had revealed so much. It was a reminder that life was full of small but important details, that assumptions could crumble when faced with the truth, and that understanding could change everything. As the streets began to dry and the rain slowed, the officer felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that every person he met carried stories he might not see, and that his role was not just to enforce rules, but to notice, to listen, and to understand. The encounter had taught him that being human was about recognizing humanity in others, even in moments of tension and misunderstanding. Officer Daniels reflected on how easily assumptions could mislead him, how quickly anger could take over when fear and misunderstanding were present. He thought about the young man, about the courage it took to stand there, and about the small tattoo that had made everything clear. It was a moment of learning that he would carry forward, a lesson in seeing the person, not just the behavior. The day continued, but the encounter remained vivid in his mind. He felt gratitude for the experience, for the reminder that understanding often begins with noticing the details, and that empathy could turn even a tense moment into something meaningful. He knew that in the future every person he met could teach him something new, and he was determined to remain open, patient, and observant, ready to see beyond assumptions and into the real story behind the eyes in front of him. The young man drove away, and Officer Daniels watched him disappear down the quiet street. There was a sense of calm now that hadn't been there before. The tension, the frustration, and the anger he had felt moments ago were replaced by reflection and understanding. He leaned against his patrol car for a moment, letting the sound of the soft rain fade into the background, and thought about what had just happened. It was more than a simple traffic stop. It was a lesson in patience, observation, and the importance of noticing details that could completely change the story. Officer Daniels thought about how easily he had assumed the worst. Just a few minutes ago, he had been certain that the young man was hiding something, certain that his nervousness meant guilt. But one small mark on the wrist had transformed his perception. It reminded him that people often carry hidden struggles, that appearances could be misleading, and that true understanding required careful attention. He returned to his patrol car, letting the rainwater drip from his coat, and began driving slowly through the neighborhood. Every passerby, every vehicle, every subtle gesture caught his eye in a new way. He noticed small details he had often overlooked before: the hesitant movements of an older man crossing the street, the nervous glances of a child holding a parent's hand, the quick pace of someone who seemed lost in thought. Each observation reminded him of the encounter he had just experienced and reinforced the lesson he had learned. Throughout the day, calls came through the radio, some routine, some urgent. Officer Daniels responded to each with a new perspective. When he approached people, he noticed not only their words but also their body language, their expressions, the small signs that told a story beyond what was said. He realized that these subtle cues often revealed more than assumptions could ever provide. He made a conscious effort to observe, to listen, and to understand, rather than to judge immediately. Later, during a break, Officer Daniels reflected on the young man and the impact of the small tattoo on his wrist. It had been almost invisible, yet it had communicated everything the young man's behavior had obscured. That tiny symbol had prevented a misunderstanding, possibly even a conflict, and had reminded him that patience and attention, could transform tense moments into opportunities for empathy and connection. He thought about how often he had relied on assumptions in the past, how quickly frustration could cloud judgment. Each time he had misjudged someone, he realized he had missed an opportunity to understand, to help, or simply to recognize the humanity in another person. This encounter was a reminder that every person had a story, often invisible, and that the small details could reveal it if noticed carefully. As the day continued, Officer Daniels found himself reflecting not only on this single interaction, but also on his approach to his work as a whole. He realized that policing was not just about enforcing laws. It was about seeing people, understanding them, and responding with empathy when possible. It required patience, careful observation, and a willingness to learn from every encounter. The young man's nervousness, once mistaken for dishonesty, had become a powerful teacher. He remembered the relief and gratitude on the young man's face, the way his shoulders had relaxed once he realized he was understood. That moment, brief as it was, had a lasting impact on Officer Daniels. He felt gratitude as well, for the lesson, for the reminder of what it meant to truly see someone, and for the opportunity to change his approach in the future. It was a small encounter, but it had shifted his perspective in a meaningful way. As the sun began to break through the clouds, Officer Daniels continued his patrol, more aware of the lives around him. He noticed neighbors tending to their gardens, children walking to school, and people going about their daily routines. Each person had their own hidden struggles, their own stories, and their own subtle signs that could easily be missed. He felt a renewed sense of purpose in his work, a commitment to approach each situation with patience, observation, and empathy. During a quiet moment, he parked his car and took a deep breath. The encounter with the young man returned to his mind, vivid and clear. He thought about how assumptions could crumble in an instant when the truth revealed itself. He understood that anger and frustration often arose from misunderstanding, and that noticing small details, small marks, small gestures, small signs, could prevent conflict and foster understanding. Officer Daniels realized that this experience would stay with him, guiding him in future interactions. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not from the enforcement of the law, but from having gained insight, from having allowed patience and observation to lead the way. The lesson was simple but profound. Every person deserved to be seen for who they truly were, and every detail mattered in understanding their story. As the day drew to a close and the streets emptied, Officer Daniels drove through the neighborhood one last time. He noticed the subtle changes brought by the fading light, the quiet rustle of leaves, the distant sound of children playing. He reflected on the young man, on the small tattoo that had revealed so much, and on the power of human connection when assumptions were set aside. The encounter had been brief, but its impact was enduring, shaping not only how he approached his job, but also how he approached understanding people in general. Returning to the station, Officer Daniels felt a sense of calm and clarity. He knew that his work would continue to present challenges, that there would be tense moments, misunderstandings, and situations where his patience would be tested. But he also knew that he had gained a valuable lesson, to look beyond appearances, to notice details, and to approach each person with empathy and understanding. He carried this lesson with him, confident that it would guide him in every interaction.